Ever start to think about what actually um, makes your internet connection happen? All that unseen gear.
Right. It's this massive web of technology.
Well, things are changing big time. There are some major shifts underway, really reshaping that whole infrastructure, from the huge data centers right down to the phone in your hand.
That's exactly right. Today we're doing a deep dive into something pretty significant. The 2025 tariffs hitting the internet and communication sector. And this isn't like a minor tweak.
No.
It's a really fundamental shift. It's affecting, well, everything from the cloud services we all use to the gadgets in our homes.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's not just one thing, it's the whole ecosystem, isn't it?
Totally.
So in this deep dive, we're going to unpack how these tariffs are hitting, advanced telecom gear, the 5G stuff,
hmm
the data center parts that keep the web running, our smartphones, routers, even satellites, and the fiber optic cables connecting everything.
And our goal here really is to cut through the noise. We want to give you a clear picture of what these tariffs are, the challenges they're creating for the manufacturers.
Yeah, the real world impact.
Exactly. And what it all means for, well, the future of the internet and how we all communicate. Just clarity. That's the aim.
Okay, sounds good. So let's get down to brass tacks. What exactly are these tariffs targeting, and what kind of numbers are we talking about here?
Well, the range is pretty eye-opening. For the advanced telecom stuff, think 5G base stations, fiber optic transceivers.
Those are the things that convert the signals, right? Light and electric.
Yeah, exactly. Those, plus network switches, antennas. We're seeing tariffs from 34% all the way up to 145%.
Wow, 145.
Yeah. And what's really crucial here is that over 40% of the telecom gear used in the U.S. comes from Chinese OEMs.
Original equipment manufacturer, so companies making stuff for others to brand.
Precisely. So these huge tariffs, they're hitting a really critical supply line, hard.
Okay, that 145% really brings that reliance into sharp focus. What about data centers? The, engines of the internet.
Right. So for the basic building blocks, they're server racks, data cables, cooling units, power supplies. Tariffs are generally in the 20 to 25% range.
Still significant.
Oh, definitely. It creates a tough spot for cloud providers who, often run on pretty tight margins anyway, and for U.S. data centers that have relied heavily on Chinese and Vietnamese suppliers for this stuff.
So the cost of cloud computing might actually start going up.
That's the potential implication, yeah.
Yeah.
It could start reversing that long trend of decreasing costs for cloud infrastructure.
Okay. And what about the things we use every day? Smartphones, routers, smart speakers.
For those consumer devices, tariffs are landing between, say, 15 and 25%. Now, the tricky part is, even if the final phone or router is assembled somewhere else, like Southeast Asia,
Yeah.
a lot of the key internal, the chips, the antennas, still come from China. So it's really, really hard for manufacturers to completely avoid these tariffs.
You can't just easily swap out those core components.
Not easily, no.
Yeah.
So the likely result, probably higher prices for consumers. It might change how much we're all willing to spend on the latest tech.
Makes sense. And it's not just stuff on the ground, is it? You mentioned satellites earlier.
That's right. The space communication sector, which is growing super fast, is facing a new 22% tariff. That's on things like satellite receivers, transmitters, ground station parts.
And that hits those big satellite internet projects.
Yeah, it's particularly noticeable for companies building those low Earth orbit or LEO constellations, the networks aimed for global internet.
Like Starlink or Project Kuiper.
Exactly. And given how global aerospace manufacturing is, finding alternative suppliers quickly, that's a real headache.
And even the actual cables. The physical internet backbone.
Absolutely. Tariffs around 18% are hitting fiber optics themselves, the glass strands, the casing around them, the amplifiers and repeaters needed for long distances, especially under the sea. This is likely going to impact the big global internet backbone providers.
Right.
They rely a lot on Asian suppliers for both the materials and the specialized manufacturing know-how.
And with data use constantly going up.
Precisely. These cost increases could have some serious long-term effects on internet speed and availability globally.
Okay, so it really sounds like these tariffs are casting a super wide net. Let's maybe zoom in a bit. How are specific parts of the industry feeling the pinch? Cloud and data centers first. What's the detailed impact there?
Okay, so as we touched on, those 20–25% tariffs on the basics, cabling, racks, power, routers, they're leading to roughly a 12 to 18% jump in hardware setup costs for the giants. Your AWS, Azure, Google Cloud.
That's a big jump for them.
It is, but the pressure, It's even more intense for the smaller guys, the co-location providers.
The ones who rent out space and infrastructure.
Right. They often have less bargaining power and historically relied even more heavily on those Chinese and Vietnamese suppliers. So for them, this could mean slower growth, tighter margins.
And this even affects newer stuff like edge computing, right? The more localized data centers.
Exactly right. Edge computing often relies on keeping costs super low for things like the enclosures and power hardware needed for those smaller distributed sites.
Right.
With tariffs on those parts potentially hitting, like 46% if they come from China or Vietnam, well, edge operators are in a bind.
46%.
Yeah, they might try to shift production closer, but that could mean losing the speed and scale they need for rapid rollouts. And ultimately, some of these extra costs from the big cloud vendors, they'll likely trickle down to the communication companies and other businesses using their services.
Okay, so the cloud is definitely feeling it. What about the companies making the broadband equipment? The routers and modems in our homes and offices.
Yeah, this sector making routers, switches, those optical network terminals for fiber connections, they're facing some pretty serious disruption.
With those potentially massive tariffs you mentioned.
Exactly. Tariffs up to 145% on Chinese components. Well, it's forcing major names like Aris, Netgear, TP-Link to completely rethink their supply chains.
Where are they looking?
They're being pushed towards places like Mexico or Eastern Europe. But those regions might not have the same manufacturing scale or, frankly, the same efficiency yet.
So it's not just about cost, it's about delays too.
That's a key insight, yeah. It's not just a higher cost, it's the potential for significant procurement delays getting the actual equipment.
And that directly impacts internet users, doesn't it?
Absolutely. You've got regional ISPs facing delays getting the gear they need. That means higher installation costs, and it makes it harder for them to upgrade networks, especially to faster fiber.
Which could slow down efforts to connect rural areas.
That's a huge concern, especially with things like the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act aiming to expand rural broadband. These rising equipment costs could genuinely make some projects economically unviable, hindering efforts to close that digital divide.
That's a critical point. So from the cloud giants down to the home router makers, everyone's affected. What about the companies building the actual telecom networks, the 5G infrastructure?
The 5G rollout has definitely hit some headwinds because of this. Key components like small cells.
Those are the smaller transmitters for dense coverage, right?
Crucial for cities. Those, plus antennas, transceivers, baseband units, mostly sourced from Asia. They also face tariffs up to that 145% mark.
So the big carriers must be scrambling.
Well, major operators like Verizon, AT&T, they're definitely having to renegotiate contracts. They're even exploring bringing some manufacturing back to the U.S., but that's, well, it's complex. It takes time.
It sounds like a massive undertaking.
It really is. And it's also slowing things down for private 5G networks, the ones being built by industries like manufacturing or healthcare. Those investment decisions were already under scrutiny.
And this adds another layer of cost and uncertainty.
Precisely. And because the whole 5G supply chain is so interconnected globally, finding tariff-free alternatives often means longer waits, maybe even technical compatibility headaches.
So the promise of 5G gets pushed back.
Effectively, yeah. The timelines for when we'll really see the full benefits, the monetization of 5G, they're definitely being extended.
Okay, let's shift focus skyward again. Satellite and space communications. You mentioned the tariff, but what are the practical effects for those LEO operators?
Well, that 22% tariff, it's causing pretty significant cost overruns for companies like SpaceX with Starlink and Amazon with Kuiper.
How significant?
We're talking potentially $7 to $12 million extra per launch cycle, just from higher component costs and the hassle of finding and qualifying new suppliers.
Wow, per launch cycle.
Yeah. And on top of that, they're also dealing with supply bottlenecks for things like rare earth materials because of Chinese export controls. It's another layer of complexity.
And I imagine this hits smaller companies even harder.
Disproportionately so, yes. Startups and smaller aerospace firms may be relying on less mainstream Chinese suppliers. They're really feeling the squeeze. Some have had to delay projects, maybe even stop production because they just can't find viable tariff-free alternatives that work for them.
Which puts those global internet coverage goals at risk.
It definitely presents a growing risk, especially for initiatives relying on these LEO networks to connect remote and underserved places.
Okay, and finally, let's swing back to the gadgets most of us touch every day. Consumer IoT, smart speakers, routers.
Right. Those devices are also getting more expensive to make. The tariffs are between 15% and 25% on both the finished products and the components inside.
So brands have to react somehow.
They do. Some are trying to shift final assembly to places like India or Brazil, countries with free trade agreements. But, as we discussed,
They still need those core Chinese parts.
exactly, they often rely on core modules,
Yeah.
wireless chipsets made in China, which fall under those higher tariff rules. So it's a real challenge. The key thing here is this could reverse the trend we've seen of smart home tech getting cheaper and cheaper.
So maybe fewer new smart home gadgets hitting the market, or they'll just cost more.
That's the likely scenario. Slower product development, longer gaps between new launches, and consumers might just become less willing to upgrade if prices jump significantly.
It could even fragment the market, maybe, if different companies are forced down different supply routes.
That's a definite possibility, yeah. A more fragmented smart home ecosystem if manufacturers face different limitations and make different compromises.
Okay, so looking across the board, it's clear these tariffs are having a really significant and varied impact. If we step back, what are the biggest overarching effects on the industry as a whole?
Well, the main headline is just increased equipment costs, pretty much everywhere. Telecom infrastructure, networking gear, broadband devices, routers, IoT stuff.
And that disrupts rollout plans.
Absolutely. It's slowing down planned timelines for crucial things like broadband expansion, 5G deployment, whatever comes next in wireless.
Yeah.
And just to give a sense of scale, in 2023, the U.S. imported $63 billion worth of phones and communication devices,
$63 billion.
and another $89 billion in computers and accessories. And a lot of the Chinese exports in those categories, fiber cables, base station parts, 5G antennas, smart routers, are now facing these tariffs.
And it's not just the direct imports, is it? There's that ripple effect through the supply chain.
Exactly right. Lots of companies use integrators, maybe in Southeast Asia or Eastern Europe, for key modules like signal processors or chipsets.
Right.
But those integrators often rely on upstream Chinese components themselves. So even if you're not buying finished goods directly from China, this indirect reliance, it's causing price swings and delays.
Especially for the smaller players.
Yeah, particularly smaller ISPs, rural cooperatives. They just don't have the bulk buying power to easily absorb or negotiate these changes. So the key point is, even indirect reliance makes you vulnerable in this new tariff world.
So what does this mean for the equipment providers themselves? What are their biggest supply side headaches?
Well, they're facing a lot more complexity. It's not like consumer electronics, where cycles are short. Internet and communication involve huge, long-term infrastructure investments, often tied up with public-private partnerships.
Which makes it hard to just pass costs on.
Exactly, especially in regulated sectors. So we're seeing procurement costs ballooning, leading to project delays, forcing companies to revise budgets for major fiber and 5G builds.
And they're forced to look for new suppliers, which you said isn't easy.
Not at all. Companies that maybe relied on cost-effective Chinese vendors like Huawei or ZTE now have to pivot. They might look at Western or other regional alternatives, but those are often pricier.
And might have longer lead times.
Longer lead times, maybe different technical specs to integrate. It's a whole process. And it hits particularly hard in those underserved rural areas that rely on government subsidies where every dollar counts.
Are there specific types of components causing bottlenecks?
Yeah, we're definitely seeing issues with some specialized items. Things like optical transceivers, microwave backhaul gear for wireless links, long-range antennas. Finding alternatives for niche components is proving tricky, and that's hindering 5G upgrades and connectivity projects for businesses and public facilities.
It sounds incredibly complicated to navigate. How can something like market research actually help companies deal with all this disruption?
Oh, in this kind of unstable trade environment, market research becomes, well, almost essential. It's a strategic tool.
More than just checking competitor prices.
Way more. It provides the real-time data, the predictive insights. The scenario planning companies need to make smart choices about sourcing, deployment, pricing, everything.
Okay, so give me an example. How does it help with the supply chain mess?
Right. Well, one huge area is getting real cross-border supply chain visibility. Market research can help map the entire chain, tracing components right back to the source, even if final assembly is elsewhere.
Ah, so you can spot if Chinese parts are just being rerouted.
Exactly. It helps distinguish genuine supplier diversification from what some call tariff leakage, where Chinese components are just shuffled through another country. Understanding where your components truly originate is suddenly critical.
That makes sense. Knowing the real origin. What else?
Infrastructure cost benchmarking is vital too. Companies need solid data to compare equipment costs under different scenarios. Buying from China, not buying from China, maybe a hybrid approach. Research provides detailed cost comparisons so ISPs and telcos can optimize their spending.
And it's not just cost, right? Reliability, security.
Absolutely key. So thorough vendor due diligence and partner audits become even more important. Market research can assess potential new vendors, maybe in India, Vietnam, Eastern Europe, looking at their reliability, security standards, manufacturing capabilities, cybersecurity practices. You need that intel before committing to a new long-term partner.
Okay, so vetting new partners. What about planning the actual network buildouts?
That's where connectivity rollout modeling and policy tracking come in. Research firms can help model different deployment scenarios based on shifting policies, subsidy availability, potential future tariff changes.
Like, what if this tariff stays for 5 years?
Exactly. Or how does a 25% tariff on base stations affect the ROI for this rural broadband project? Or could this new trade deal make sourcing from country X viable? It helps model those what-ifs.
And ultimately, it connects back to the customer, right? Understanding how we react.
Totally. Customer sentiment and service pricing analysis. Research helps providers figure out how price-sensitive subscribers are. How much of a cost increase will people tolerate before they jump ship? Customer churn,
Especially in competitive markets.
right, where prices are already under pressure. That info is gold for figuring out pricing strategies and how to communicate any necessary price changes.
It definitely sounds like the industry isn't just sitting back and taking it. What kind of strategic moves are companies actually making?
We are seeing a lot of adaptation. The big vendors, Cisco, Ericsson, Nokia, they're actively boosting production capacity outside China. India, Czech Republic, Brazil, places like that.
And the service providers, AT&T, Comcast.
They're definitely renegotiating contracts, trying to prioritize suppliers who are local or exempt from tariffs where they can. And interestingly, some smaller rural operators are teaming up, forming procurement alliances to get better bargaining power together.
That's smart. Are manufacturers changing how they design things too?
Some are, yes.
Yeah.
Investing in more modular product designs. That makes it easier to swap out components from different suppliers if needed, gives them more flexibility. Others are using AI-based supply chain platforms for better visibility and risk assessment.
Trying to predict the next disruption.
Kind of, yeah. And of course, there's lobbying. A lot of companies are pushing for tariff exemptions or specific carve-outs, especially for projects focused on rural connectivity or bridging that digital divide.
So it's a really dynamic situation. Companies are actively trying to adapt and find ways around these challenges.
Absolutely. It's very fluid. The companies that will likely fare best are the ones that can be both strategic and agile, using market research not just to react, but to actually drive innovation, optimize costs, and plan for a future that, well, it's definitely going to look different.
Okay, so wrapping this up. The main point seems to be that these 2025 tariffs are genuinely reshaping the whole internet and communication landscape. It's not just about things costing a bit more.
No, not at all.
It's this really complex web of challenges hitting supply chains, slowing down network rollouts, and ultimately affecting the tech we all rely on constantly.
That really is the key takeaway. Understanding these shifts isn't really optional anymore. It's crucial for everyone involved, consumers, businesses, providers, everyone.
Yeah. And as we finish this deep dive, it really leaves you thinking, doesn't it? How might these tariffs permanently change where tech gets made, where innovation happens? The geography of tech. Exactly. And what unforeseen effects could pop up for global connectivity, for getting everyone online, as countries try to balance their own economic policies with, well, how interconnected our digital world actually is.
Definitely a lot to ponder there. The tension between national policy and global reality.